Hey, everybody, welcome to another edition of Probably Private, where you're going to learn more about privacy engineering and what it is. I'm here with Tariq, who is joining us today to talk all about his career in privacy engineering. Tariq, you want to take a moment to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hey everyone. I'm Tariq Yusuf. I've been in privacy probably better part of God, it's probably been like 8 years, almost 8 years at this point, but I've been working in tech, mostly in big tech. I was at Google doing a number of roles and ended up starting working in privacy. About half my time there, moved over to Facebook for a little bit. And then I went to do my master's in jurisprudence at the UW Law School, focusing on privacy law and technology policy. And right now, I am a senior privacy engineering consultant at Callis Group, a smallish security consulting firm in the Seattle area, working with a large range of clients and customers.
Awesome. And we got connected because Damien, whose episode was the first episode, said that you had some very interesting and spicy opinions about privacy and privacy engineering.
Yeah, it's kind of funny because I think the field helps reset a lot of things that we find as that are problems in the tech industry as a whole. But it's in one of those points where it's kind of a defining moment where I think depending on the place and area that you're practicing it, it can take a very different meaning.
Interesting. Okay. I hope that you can expand a bit more on this opinion as we go through. But first, what even is privacy engineering?
Yes, it's a very, very good question. Oftentimes I'll have to kind of discuss this even with clients that I work with because the word is kind of thrown around and there's not really a clear, consistent definition that you see across even just the industry. So privacy engineering, the way that I like to define it is the general practice or effort of figuring out how to align user expectations with technical specifications. For an example, there's a lot of variance in expectations and lack of knowledge as far as what happens with our data and our interactions online. If you use Facebook, if you use X or any app, you're using it and you're getting some benefit from it, but it's unclear what that trade-off is. You don't know what is happening from the data that you're providing to it, what's happening from the interactions. And so privacy engineering in the broadest possible sense is trying to work to align the user expectations with what's actually happening. Part of that takes place as a means of technical precautions or being able to create technical assertions in the product development process. But some of that is also how can we communicate and how can users understand what's happening with their data and how can we make sure that that expectation aligns with what's actually happening. So I often say it's a little bit more subjective than security engineering, which is kind of a related field, in the sense that security engineering is very focused on, is there an objective risk here with a sufficiently complicated or sufficiently talented adversary? Could they get into this system versus privacy, which is more interested in, you know, what the kind of social norms and social expectations are, which can vary from country to country or even within subcultures in different places.
Ooh. I hope you'll expand on some of that. And I think it's really interesting because it's kind of this thing where you have this valley between how somebody thinks something is working and how it's actually working. And of course, as you very well point out, depending on what groups you ask, they might have different opinions.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think part of the challenge is that as an industry as a whole, the tech industry hasn't done a very good job at being transparent and helping with that user education problem, right? Most of the people, even the kind of more savvy generations from a technology perspective, still don't really fully understand what's happening with data that they produce and provide and are only slowly learning about it through the consequences that we're seeing. Like I remember reading, I don't remember exactly where it was from, but I was reading an article that was talking about a little bit of like resentment from Generation Z about their parents posting pictures of them when they were kids on the internet and feeling violated in some way of that, especially seeing what can happen as they come of age and as they see the consequences of actions that they did that maybe were spurs of a moment or maybe weren't even intended to be public interactions, now having real consequences down the road for them.
Yeah. 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 And I mean, we see this in the product design of things like air tags, where I think if you had ever asked somebody who is a victim of household abuse, they would have said, yeah, maybe not such a hot idea. Any transparent tracking. Yeah. So important to get diverse voices, right? So, but I want to hear about I think maybe you can cast some light on this for us. How did you decide to get involved in privacy as a career, and why is privacy important to you?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think like a lot of people right now, there's not one paved path to privacy, and so it ends up being kind of a happening to find the right people and get connected to the right places at the right time. So I started working in tech right out of college. I went to get my bachelor's in computer science, and then I had the fortunate opportunity of starting to work in big tech. So I started at Google. I focused on computer security as like my focus in undergrad, but started working in kind of DevOps, which I think was a good starting experience because I think to start thinking about the type of work you want to do in privacy or security or any place like that, you have to think of what can go wrong. And I think while it felt like a weird detour when I started, it actually was really good for me because it's easier to think about what can technically go wrong and then start expanding out to what happens when you start throwing external factors into it. So that prepared me for the opportunity to start working in enterprise cloud security. So we started working on a lot of the early zero trust tooling that was in Google Cloud. And that was also just kind of a really interesting field to work in because at that point, zero trust architecture was still relatively new and everyone was still like very attached to VPNs. And then I had a chance there where someone reached out to me, former classmate, said, "Hey, I'm working in this privacy org, and we need someone to help with new hardware products that Google's building." And so it was a really cool opportunity. Like, yeah, I'd love, it's something I'm interested in, and I think I'm a bit weird in the sense where I'm one of the few optimists, I'd say, in the general risk engineering space. And so, like, yeah, I think like yes, IoT is very terrifying, and I have had some of my favorite then Twitter accounts that I would follow that would talk about how terrible they could be. But I think there's a positive path that can come from it. So I decided to start working on that. And that was a really great experience because in my extra time, both in college and when I started working, I was working a lot on like civic advocacy. I worked a lot with the Council on American Islamic Relations, the chapter in the Seattle area, kind of on voter activation stuff and different programs that advocate for people who've had their rights kind of systematically stripped. And so entering into privacy was a very interesting experience because it was, in essence, a merging of those two interests that I had. I could work on the technical parts of security and reliability that I was really good at, and also marry this point of advocacy and being a voice for the people not in that room and not, not with badge access, right? And so as I started working on that, I realized that one, there's not really a lot of knowledge as far as the kinds of risks that can come with technology. And there's some institutional factors that we can get into about that. And also, there's not a lot of people that have figured out how to systematize that, at least at the time. And that's kind of grown over the last couple of years, where now we have like the topics of like machine learning fairness and algorithmic bias are now regular day-to-day conversational pieces. And being able to be there and say, hey, like, you know, what happens if your risk model rejects people from predominantly black zip codes? Being able to be in the room and bring this up and then see the pause and like, oh, I didn't think about what would happen if we did that. And being able to have those moments repeatedly where, yeah, maybe I'm talking about really bad worst case scenarios, but it's getting people to think about them, which is a big difference from where we were before. And that moment was, and those moments that I've had throughout working in privacy is kind of what kept me working here to the point where I'd rather, go somewhere else and continue to work on privacy. And eventually that led me to working on consulting because I think it's a great opportunity to be able to look beyond just, you know, big tech because data is everywhere and everyone's dealing with data in different capacities. And if that knowledge doesn't even exist in a lot of places in big tech, your, you know, corner restaurant that has a cloud point of sale solution isn't going to have that either.
Yeah, and I mean, I think you bring up a really important point, which I think is something that I've tried to talk about a lot, but it's like privacy in a lot of ways that we've formed it, particularly in this global north and Western culture gets to define the way privacy exists for everyone, is privacy is power and privilege. And therefore, of course, it's tied with all of the other systemic issues that we have. And that means that, you know, an unequal access to privacy exists. And the idea of over surveillance, particularly of some communities over others, based on arbitrary things like ethnicity, race, religion, and so forth. I think it's really powerful that you bring up that privacy risk is also not evenly distributed across folks. And it's just some even playing field where we can say, well, any one individual comes to this with the same privacy risk. And I think that really goes back to also what you said about security. It's a different paradigm that we have.
Yeah. And I think a big part is, as you hit, is that there is no, with security, we kind of assume just based on technical access and resources. Privacy has so many other factors that play in from, the type of society that you're in to the specific elements about your life. I mean, talking about religion and ethnicity, that is something that really affected me growing up because I mean, I'm Muslim and a brown looking person post 9/11. And that experience growing up, there was a lot of self censoring and things that I didn't participate in or I would not have said or did not say because of this kind of fear of surveillance and the entire institutions that were built to surveil people like me. I mean, there's a lot of mosques in the Seattle area where I grew up that pretty much every 8 to 12 months, there would be a story of someone catching an FBI agent undercover there. And, it's kind of one of those things where one time you think, okay, maybe it's just something they're saying, but to have it happen repeatedly at different places. And so understanding firsthand what that chilling effect, what we call now the chilling effect of feeling like you're being watched, and how it can limit otherwise positive behaviors in an open society. We want to make sure that we don't replicate that in other places. I mean, there's a whole conversation that can happen about how do we work as a government to do that. Although I think in a lot of ways, European countries are a bit more prepared to have those conversations versus the American aligned ones.
Yeah, it's interesting that you point that. I think obviously I'm American who has now been in Europe for 10 years. For context, should anybody not know, it is really interesting because obviously here in Germany, I think a big part of the awareness around privacy is not only due to the Nazis and how the Nazis used data to commit genocide amongst multiple groups of people, the Jews, the Romas, and many queer people and other groups, but also the Stasi. And I'm in Berlin, which means there's a lot of also East German politics that affects here. And it's a very interesting part of some of East German culture. I mean, the small anecdote, one of the places where it's recommended to have the most open conversations is in the sauna in East German population because you knew that nobody could bring a mic because there's no place for a microphone. But it's just the idea of constant surveillance. And like you say, then the constant questioning, and there's some things that you can't remove. You can't remove the color of your skin. You can't remove, or maybe you can, but maybe you don't want to remove other aspects of your religion and identity that are projected. And there's the majority view, or the superiority view in a power structure, and then there's the other, right? And privacy is so entwined in this stuff of who gets to be who they are, where.
Yeah, like one example that I think that I use as far as kind of a difference in cultural values, right? Like the women in my life like choose to wear the hijab. Right? This becomes a very interesting conversation because everyone has phones, right? And everyone can take pictures with their phones. And so you'll see even just among the population of people who wear the hijab, there is a very different perspective on things like automatic backups of photos. There's very different perspectives of when should I take photos, when should I even have them on my phone, right? And so you'll often see either they will never have photos of themselves without the hijab on when they have their phone, even on end-to-end encrypted video calls. Or you will see that they might take advantage of like some sort of like backup features and say these photos aren't going to be backed up. But it kind of shows a different dimension. So these types of problems and the lack of awareness of what's happening with your data that you maybe wouldn't see in kind of the typical Western context.
Yeah. Yeah. And did that disproportionately affect some persons or groups as a group and also as individuals?
Mhm.
So that's very interesting. So maybe that's some of the difficulty of working in privacy engineering that you've seen. How have you in your career moved conversations, or like what other difficulties have been presented to you, and how have you kind of shifted and changed based on your knowledge and learnings and your insights?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think a big part of what's changed the conversational dynamic for me in terms of what how I have approached privacy and how I've talked about privacy with other people is understanding that what's the underlying incentive to, for lack of a better term, do the right thing, whatever the right thing is. And I realized that a big part of that is organizational power dynamics. Everything kind of goes down to power dynamics in the end, whether it's at a societal level or an organizational level. If your privacy organization is not empowered to advocate for the right thing, it can limit the perspective of the results. So when I'm having a conversation with a product team, I have to think about, okay, how much do I want to push on this? Because there's a couple of things that are playing here. One, if it's going to be escalated up to management, which perspective is management likely to take? Is my management willing to back up the decisions of the calls that I make? Because there naturally has to be a bit more of a trust. If you are a manager or a director in privacy, you're going to get escalated to a lot more than if you're in other organizations, even security, I would argue. Because your organization as a whole is pushing against the power dynamics of the organization. Yeah, the privacy organization is pushing against the dynamics of the larger organizational structure. And so you're going to have to, as in many ways, say, we have to think of a different way of doing this, or we have to look through a different perspective. And it's difficult because a lot of the tech industry is focused on here's some of the technical reasons as to why, but these are not really technical reasons. So often the way that I've approached this is they say, like, hey, what's the user base that you're targeting? Because there's a lot of discussion about, there's a lot of, I guess, what I would call data inspired metrics where, we'll do they'll say, oh, we have these user metrics that say users want this or whatever. And being able to push back and show with either other user experience research or studies and show like, no, this is something actually that users want. And or look at the use cases that they're saying or the user journeys, the critical user journeys that they're looking at and say, well, if I was to step through this subjectively, this is what I would be thinking about if I was a person in this circumstance. And often cases, it's a lot of privacy work is teaching an exercise in empathy and understanding this is how someone from this perspective might view it. An example that I had a chance to work on is, I was working on IoT devices, so smart speakers, cameras, different things like this. One of the things we had to really think about was if someone is using these devices and they are in an abusive relationship dynamic, or they have an abusive partner. What happens in that case? Is the abuser able to use the connection to these devices to exert more power and authority over this? Obviously, like we're not in the position to go and fix every relationship or fix every power dynamic, but can we avoid making these things worse? And I think that is a kind of good example of the types of conversations that we have beyond the privacy enhancing technologies and stuff like this. It's about what are we actually enabling and what are the underlying problems that we're now creating with this new technology.
I love it. That is so hard to do. I'm curious, how have you seen that work? Like, is there a recipe? I mean, of course, every recipe is going to be a little different, but is there the right people in the room? Is it the right questions? How do you actually foster that conversation?
Yeah. One of the things that I learned, in some cases very abruptly, that a big part of this is having the being able to have the right decision makers on your side. And so this is what I talk through. And I think we're starting to see this now in the European Union, where there's a question of, are your DPOs actually independent of the rest of the organization, right? And so having a level of independence, both within your privacy management chain, as well as privacy with the rest of the organization, that is something that's really that really makes a difference. Because if I'm going to make a call and say, hey, I'm going to say no to this thing, or say, hey, we need to seriously change this, I need to have the trust as a practicing professional that I'm going to get that necessary backup. And the challenge that comes with that is that, everyone has a different perspective, everyone has different opinions. And so as an individual contributor in the practice, I have to say, are other people going to take my perspective? And as a manager in the organization or director in the organization, I have to say, I may not necessarily agree with what this person sees, but to some degree, it's better to trust it because they see all the facts on the ground and they may have a different perspective than I do. And I realized that a lot of what you can do from a privacy perspective, it really depends on how the organization as a whole views it. Because privacy in different organizations, like there are some organizations that say it's more of a compliance function. The organizations we plug in with are compliance organizations, and they are responding to audits, and we need to make sure that we are doing the actions related to that. No more, no less.
Mhm.
And sometimes that is due to the necessity of like how much it takes to grow that, because the actual complexity that comes with running a privacy organization is not it's not a simple task to run. But there's also a difference of like, hey, if we see problems, at what point do we choose to tackle them, or at what points do we choose to say we're going to let this slide for now? And it becomes a difficult game because you're trying to kind of negotiate a very pragmatic approach of not trying to boil the ocean, but also making sure that you're not giving a free pass or letting things fall through the cracks that you otherwise wouldn't know about. And
Mhm.
so I think these are the things that are often overlooked in privacy organizations as a whole, as they're thinking about what does it mean for us to actually have a privacy function beyond the legal counsel and the DPO.
Yeah. Then you're pointing out like a really good thing too is like maybe when it's a small privacy org, that conversation is really easy, right? Like as you're talking about like smaller orgs, but then maybe as the org grows or if it's already a big org, it's like how do you actually have the communication path functioning? So,
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's a client I'm working with right now, and we're building out a new privacy function. And one of the things we have to think about is how does this overlap with our legal counsel? How does this overlap with the rest of security? How does this overlap with our governance and compliance team that's actually talking with the auditors? Should we be talking with the auditors? Should we even be in the infosec or legal departments? Organizationally, where should those go? And there's a lot it becomes kind of one of the points where you're trying to kind of form, what do you mean when you say a privacy function? And it's kind of the point where you realize that this could mean so many different things. It could mean a simple matter of, we're managing one trust for the team, or we're the team that triages data subject requests.
Yeah.
It could also mean, hey, we're actually going and doing design audits across the company. Or it could mean we're in charge of making sure that the evidence pipeline for auditors is working and fine. So we have, like, say, audits of what cookies, so that we know and have documentation of what cookies are being stored. We know, and we have documentation over how quick it takes of us to respond to a data subject request. We know and have data on how our retention policies are addressed. Um, or you take an even broader perspective of, say, this is an important value to the company as a whole. And so we want to try to see, what can we do to actually fully address this? And that's where you can kind of broaden into the picture of, what does it mean to be a trusted organization for your users? What does it mean to have a comprehensive approach that spreads across as a cultural shift versus just the organizational task?
That's awesome. And also really inspiring. You need to have a compliance department and have all of the compliance things, right? That's fine. But privacy as multidisciplinary, but also kind of like what you're talking about in the very beginning, user research, talking with the users, identifying potential different groups of users and figuring out what are their needs, and then building products that actually meet their needs, which is, of course, like super inspiring work in comparison to just doing compliance work.
Yeah, and I think fundamentally that is something I think that is often lost, especially when we start talking about, like, the privacy regulations that are coming down. Like, fundamentally, the thing that's lost in translation as you're reading the details of, what your Article 13 reports have to look like, is that fundamentally the policy goal that is trying to be achieved here is that we want organizations that are dealing with data to actually show they care about it. And these are specific evidentiary requirements that we have to actually show that. But can you actually demonstrate that you have a set of principles that you're sticking to in your organization as a whole, which is very different from the normal incentives of business. The normal incentive of business is, you want to be good to your shareholders. This is adding, I would argue, to some degree, one of the few additional things that organizations now have to keep in mind. Because, I mean, we've had consumer protection laws, for example, that mean you can't deceive your customers, or you can't deceive people you're advertising to, or whatever. But this is adding a new balance where the purpose of privacy laws is that you have your obligations to your shareholders as a company, but you also have an obligation to the people that are your customers and the people who you're using to generate that profit. Fundamentally, the goal is to kind of shift that balance of power so that there is actually not quite the level of a fiduciary duty, but a legal duty to actually make sure that you are treating your customers with the same prioritization matrix as you would your shareholders.
I love it. And you wouldn't have your shareholders if you didn't have customers, right?
Exactly. I would argue this is a thing that's already balanced there, but it's often kind of lost in translation.
Yes, totally, totally. Okay, I think you've probably inspired some people. I'm definitely feeling inspired. How would you recommend somebody get into privacy, and particularly like this type of really inspirational work?
It's a good question. The path is still very nascent in terms of how to get in there. If you are kind of still in school, there's definitely look at some of the increasing programs that are focusing privacy engineering. CMU obviously has their master's program that I've heard wonderful things about, and every person I've talked with out of that program has been excellent. Beyond that, look at ways to kind of get into other related fields in kind of the broader risk engineering division, whether it's software reliability, whether it's security, just to build those adversarial thinking muscles. Most of the paths into privacy often will route through some other place. And so finding places where you can exercise that perspective can often help a lot. And the other option is you can also leverage resources that are kind of in your area. Like, for example, IAPP resources are often more tuned towards the legal side, but they can still be some good resources. And there's an increasing number of privacy engineering related resources that are coming down that path. Differences. A lot of what got me into privacy was just networking and meeting the right people. And so, as hard as it can be, sometimes the occasional putting yourself out there can be a powerful thing.
Awesome. Thanks for the advice. So, what's your future predictions for privacy engineering? Or maybe also, like, what are your hopes and dreams for where it goes?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think privacy engineering as a whole is at a pretty pivotal moment because, like I said before, the definition of what privacy engineering is varies a lot depending on the organization you're going to. I think what needs to be decided is whether privacy engineering is just going to be another specialization name for types of technologies, like how you have, AI experts that are focused on training LLMs, or if it's going to be a shift in how we think about approaching technology. What I'd like to see privacy engineering go as a whole is I'd like to see privacy engineering as the home for applied technology ethics. Because privacy engineering, by definition, is putting a limit on what the business can do. That is the goal of ethics as a whole. And a lot of what we do is it's very much a golden rule type of approach where I wouldn't want this thing done to me. So why should we do it to other users? And so I would like to see this evolve into how can we actually take the conversations from both AI ethicists, from policymakers, and from sociologists and actually apply this in a way that says, here's how we can build a proactive picture of what technology looks like and what the type of technology that we want to have as a society. And I think if that shift can take place, it can, I think, build a little bit more of the kind of positive, build a bit more in the direction of the positive sci-fi utopia that we would like to be in, but often find ourselves a little bit distant from.
That is so inspirational. And that's a huge counterpoint to maybe other factors in a business. I hope that that happens.
You and I
Um,
both.
yeah, thanks. Maybe it's happening. Maybe your consulting is starting it. So, Tarek, how do people follow your work? How do they get in touch with you to work with you as a consultant, other things like this?
Yeah. So my website is tariqyusuf.in. We could probably put in the description of the video. You can also find me on Mastodon from there. If you're interested in working with me in a consultant capacity, you can get a Callus group. We're trying to do a lot of work to kind of build out privacy as a practice there. And I'm always happy just to have a quick conversation and just talk about what is it that you're thinking about and what types of problems do you see and what you're working on and how can we move the needle in a bit more of a positive direction?
I love it. I love it. Thank you so much. I'm feeling super inspired. I hope so listening have learned a few things about the many dimensions of privacy. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you
And
for having me.